Hello and welcome to the final chapter of this introduction to the SketchUp to Maxwell plugin. Now, before I get too far into this particular chapter, I want to tell you again that this is far from comprehensive and there's a huge amount of functionalities that are in this plugin that I can't really cover within the time that we have available to us. So I would again recommend that you read the SketchUp manual and of course read the Maxwell manual, as well as get on the forum. The forum is a remarkable resource and it has its own dedicated SketchUp forum within it where you'll find me, I go by the name of Half-Life, and you'll find Jeremy, the plugin developer, right there available to answer your questions, as well as many other experienced and knowledgeable SketchUp to Maxwell users. So please take advantage of the resources and get involved in the community. It really is its own reward. Now, that said, we're going to be focusing in this particular training video on the output. And the output really comes in a couple of different parts. The first part here that controls the output is the context menu. So if we click on an item and then we context click, if we go down to the Maxwell menu here, you're going to see that we can export to Maxwell, to Studio, to MXS. Only that selection. We can, of course, control the UVs that we've already talked about. We can separate by face or by material. Right now, by default, it's set to none. And we can also choose to hide it from the view, from the camera, from the GI, which is global illumination, from the reflections and refractions, and from Z-clip. Now, again, those are all things that you're going to probably want to look into the manual. And the reason why is because they're generally kind of special effects type stuff. So, I'm not going to worry too much about that. But what I will say in the meantime is the other part of the output is in the Maxwell Scene Manager under the Output tab. You'll see that we have some options here. The first set of options have to do with the name and the folder that your Maxwell scene and all those files are going to be output into. By default, the plugin takes the name of the SketchUp file and applies that to the name of the output file as well as the Maxwell scene file. And it puts it in the same folder that you've saved your SketchUp file to. So if you're okay with that, then you don't need to put anything in here. However, if you want to give it a custom name and you want to give it a custom folder, then you can set those up here. Now, in addition to that, you can also set up what type of image you want to output. And generally speaking, I tend to use PNG, but you could use HDR, EXR if you're looking to do some sort of high-end type stuff with it. Below that, we have our export settings. And the very first one here is Pack and Go. And Pack and Go basically collects everything that makes up the Maxwell scene, including the geometry, the Maxwell materials, all of the images, everything, and puts them all into one folder so that you can send that to a render farm, or you can take that to multiple different computers. So you're working at home and you're working at work and you have a Maxwell license at both locations, then maybe that might be the thing for you. So Pack and Go is useful in that way. Now, there is a downside of Pack and Go, and the downside of Pack and Go is that if you're not careful about how you name your image maps that you use in your textures, you can oftentimes create problems where two textures have the same name for two different images. And what happens is the plugin gets confused as to which one it is that you're actually wanting to use for which material, and it can cause output problems. So the solution to that, of course, is to be very careful about how you name your textures so that no two textures have the same name. However, if you can't get around that problem, then the easiest solution is simply to turn off Pack and Go, and that will solve the problem. Now below that, we have Use Instances. And Use Instances is basically the same as using components in SketchUp. They function in very similar ways. They have a lot of the same kind of concepts. And generally speaking, you're going to want to use instances. There's only a couple of reasons why you might not want to use instances, and one of them is if you're going to be using displacement. Instances do not support displacement, so you can't use displacement. Now, of course, instances also can't do motion blur, but we don't worry about motion blur because there's no animation export from SketchUp to Maxwell. And then finally, instances cannot support emitters. And so if you have any kind of geometry that has displacement or emitters assigned to it in your SketchUp scene, they will be exported as regular geometry and not as instances. Now, below that, we have the ability to use face materials, front only or both. The idea being, of course, if you're a sloppy modeler and you haven't been paying attention to making sure that your front side is where you have facing out on all your modeling, then this can be something that you can set to make your life a little easier, and it'll output the way that you expect it to from SketchUp. I tend to be a fairly neat modeler, so I tend to use front only. Below that, we have render hidden layers. And the idea with render hidden layers is that you can put heavy geometry that maybe you don't want to always see in your SketchUp scene because of the slowing down of navigation and such like this. But at the same time, you want it to render at render time. Well, you just turn on render hidden layers, and it will do exactly what it says. It'll render anything that's hidden. Now, below that, we have Auto MXM. And the idea with Auto MXM is somewhat complicated, but the bottom line is that it switches out any SketchUp material that has the exact same name that an MXM somewhere on your system does. And it just does that automatically. You don't have to go in there and associate the two files together. You just simply give them the same name, and it'll do the work for you so long as you have that enabled. Below that, we have proxies. And the idea with proxies is that you can have a low poly proxy object that is a stand-in for a high poly object somewhere in your scene that you want to propagate throughout the scene at render time. And this could be useful for things like cars, it could be useful for things like trees, all different types of objects that maybe have a lot of polygon detail that you want to propagate throughout the scene, and maybe you want to do some transformations to and such like that. But at the same time, you don't want to actually have all those polys in your SketchUp scene because SketchUp can't handle it. Well, the solution there is to use proxies. Below that, we have the engine options. And the very first two here, I recommend that you just jack these up as high as you can stand because you can stop Maxwell at any time that you want to. And the truth is that the longer Maxwell renders, the better it looks. So there's never a point in time you're going to say, oops, I forgot to turn it off, and oh, gee, I ruined it. No, it only gets better with more rendering time. So certainly let it render for as long as possible. I usually let stuff render overnight, and then I come back in the morning and it looks beautiful. Below that, we have threads. And the concept of threads is very simple. If you set it for 0, it uses all the CPUs on your machine, no matter how many CPUs you may have. If you set it for a particular number, then it's only going to use that number of CPUs. And so if you have a particular reason for setting it for a particular number of CPUs, then you can do that. But generally speaking, I recommend leaving it at 0. Below that, we have multi-light. And you can see here we have three options. We have off, intensity, and color plus intensity. And what I will say about multi-light is that multi-light is a really, really cool feature that you have access to when you go to render. However, they have their own video for multi-light, so I'm not going to get into how to actually use multi-light other than to say that I'm going to want you to turn on color plus intensity for this particular render so that you can play with multi-light after you watch the multi-light video on the Think site. Below that, we have command line. And the command line is just a means for putting in text commands that will give you extra control over your render. However, this has largely been replaced by scripting in the newer version of Maxwell, and so I don't use command line much anymore. Now below that, if you go to Show Advanced View, you'll see that we have materials and we have override, which will allow us to set a default material that will override everything that's in the model, no matter what materials you have assigned, no matter what the UVs are, it will automatically assign its material. Now, why would you want this? Well, usually it's used for clay renders, which can sometimes be useful, although I've also seen it used for people who want to do some sort of ambient occlusion type effects and stuff like that as well. Below that, we have default material. And the idea with that is, of course, if you want your default to be anything other than the actual Maxwell default, which is that sort of grayish material that Maxwell spits out if you don't have a material assigned, then you can set whatever you want the default to be right here. Below that, you'll see that we have the render channels. And there's way more information here than I could possibly get into in this quick tutorial. But the idea here is that if you need to do some compositing type things, then you might want to use an alpha, or you might want to use shadow or something along those lines, and that's what this is here for. Below that, we have tone mapping and we have simulens. And I recommend that both tone mapping and simulens, that you do those in the render application. And the reason why is because you have full control over those when you're rendering, and there's really no good reason to set them here in SketchUp, in my opinion. Now below that, we have render layers. And render layers are basically what makes Maxwell renders look the way they look. You have three render layers. You have illumination, reflection, and refraction. And by default, they're all set to both. This is the full quality Maxwell render. If you set it for anything other than both on any of these, then you are handicapping Maxwell, and you're causing it to give you a lower quality render. Now, you may gain some time from that, but unless you're shooting for a particular special effect, I don't really recommend that you tweak those. I recommend that you leave those alone. Now, one final little bit of information before we get into multi-light is I want to go up and I want to delete my IES sphere. And the reason why is because that IES sphere is going to cause problems when we go to render multi-light. For one thing, IES doesn't respect multi-light. And for the second thing, it seems to kind of confuse the system a little. So I just recommend that you just delete it, get it out of your scene altogether. And now you go ahead and you hit render. And when you hit render, what'll happen after you wait maybe, say, half hour, 45 minutes, is that you'll have a nice render that you can begin to play with multi-light on after watching the multi-light video. And it really is a cool, fun thing, and you'll thank me later.